Yeah, so at this point, before we get started with the official presentation, just to give us a little bit more time for people coming in after 10, we're going to go over just a couple of quick slides about what extension is and what Master Gardeners are, because among many things, Dolly Foster, our presenter, is also a Master Gardener with Purdue Extension, and she's also affiliated with Extension. I'm the urban agriculture extension educator for Lake County, Indiana with Purdue Extension, and she's on my ag advisory council, which is so helpful. And Renee is a coworker of mine who helps with the agriculture program with Purdue Extension in Lake County. So everybody should be able to see a screen now that Dolly is sharing that says Purdue Extension. And the mission of Purdue Extension is the education of Indiana citizens through the application of the land-grant university research and knowledge base for the benefit of agriculture, youth, families, and communities. We have 4 programs that include agriculture and natural resources and home horticulture, which the Master Gardener program falls under. We also have health and human sciences. We have food, nutrition, education, and community development, and 4-H. A lot of people can think of 4-H first off, but they might not know that it's actually affiliated with Extension. Next slide, please. Just to have this at the forefront of people's minds, Purdue promotes equal opportunity. So it is the policy for Purdue to make sure that everyone has equal access to educational programs. Next slide, please. And then I'd like to talk briefly about the Master Gardeners. So Master Gardeners is an extension program. It is a nationally recognized certification program through Purdue, through different universities, different land-grant universities throughout the US. And Purdue is the land-grant university for Indiana. So our Master Gardeners are Purdue Extension Master Gardeners. And their role is to assist Purdue Extension educators by providing horticulture education in their counties. So these are many things that Master Gardeners do. Presenting this program that Dolly does would be considered one way that Master Gardeners contribute to education in their communities. And as we can see today, also outside of their communities throughout the country and even the world. Next slide, please. In order to become an Extension Master Gardener, you have to enroll in the course. So there's a 14-week course that happens every year in most counties across Indiana and in also other counties in different states. So it's a 14-week long course that people go through. It's pretty intensive. You learn a lot of very useful information. You get a very thick binder and book of resources, and you have to achieve a 70% passing score on an exam to become an intern, and then you become fully certified by completing 40 volunteer hours, and you maintain your certification by volunteering 12 hours a year and attending 6 hours of additional education per year. So a program like this would be considered volunteer hours for Dolly and education hours for any Master Gardeners other Master Gardeners who are attending. And as mentioned before, trainings are available across the state and also in many other states. So all you would have to do is contact your local county extension office to be put on a prospective Master Gardener list. I see some questions about the Master Gardener program. Just real briefly, at this point, you have to be 18 to enroll in the class to become a Master Gardener, but we do have junior Master Gardener programs that might be available in different counties. I know we have one in Lake County that's kind of at a request basis. So if a school or an after-school group wanted to have a junior Master Gardener program, you can definitely still reach out to me in Lake County, Indiana, or different counties throughout the state. And you can share the link to the video with other people. It won't be publicly available, so you won't be able to find it by searching, like by Googling the presentation. but you will be able to share the link with other people. Yes. Okay. So that's all I have. And at this point, we're going to turn things over to Dolly Foster. She'll give an introduction about herself, and we're going to start learning about winter seed sowings. Take it away, Dolly.
Okay, now I'm muted. Okay, so good morning, everybody. This is a very highly anticipated program from what I have seen.
Dolly, you're a little quiet. I don't know what happened.
Hold on. Okay, how's that?
Yes, much better.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. There's going to be about 200 people on here, we think, maybe 3 if everybody comes and logs on. So keep yourself muted. And we're keeping track of where everybody is from where you guys live down in the chat. If you can find the chat box down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get started. I have a short little intro, tell you guys about myself, because there's a few people on here who know me, but it looks like the vast majority of people are from all over the country. It looks like we even have a few people from other countries, which is great. I have been a master gardener for 20 years, and I work as a professional horticulturist for a park district in Illinois. I live in Indiana and work in Illinois. And at my job, I manage a community garden that I started with our park district and with the support of the Illinois County Extension, the U of I County Extension 6 years ago. I also manage all of the landscaping around the park district, which is almost exclusively pollinator gardens. And I educate about all of those things: vegetable gardening, pollinator gardens, butterfly gardening. One of the other things I do in my job is I plan the Monarch Fest that we have in Oak Lawn, Illinois every fall in September. And that's a really exciting and fun event we love doing in Illinois, or in Oak Lawn rather. And like I said, I've been educating on gardening, all things gardening, for about 20 years. So I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. It's going to be a little long, so if you have to step away, just go ahead and step away and come back and put your questions down in the chat. We're going to have 2 chat sessions, and we are recording this lecture. So if you do not want your face on the window with all the other faces for the duration of this lecture, you should turn your camera off now, and we'll get started. So for those of you who are not familiar, what is winter sowing? Winter sowing is a gardening outside method of starting seeds. It's a very interesting method of starting seeds. I don't even remember where I found out about it. I don't remember how I was introduced to it, but I did find Trudy Davidoff's website, wintersown.org, several years ago, and someone had probably told me about it. And I explored through her website, and there's other people out there in the internet who are bloggers who also talk about winter sowing. And now there's lots and lots of resources on YouTube about winter sowing, which I think is very exciting, that it's spreading all over the place and people are really benefiting from it. So what this is all about is starting your seeds outdoors in winter. And for those of us who live in regions where we actually have a pretty significant and well-formed winter, for lack of a better term, we sometimes have a hard time starting seeds inside. And so this is a great alternative. You're going to use a milk jug or some other kind of plastic container. And the most important thing to know about winter sowing, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about it, but the most important thing is to understand that the freeze and thaw periods that we go through in our natural winter progression through the year is what helps the seed to open up and to germinate. So the soil is moist inside the jug. The freeze and thaw periods encourage that seed to pop open, and then it germinates when it wants to, when it's appropriate. So why would you use this method? Well, I'll tell you why I use this method. I use this method because I have an older home. It's kind of small. I don't have very many windows that are facing enough light in order to start seeds. And starting seeds down in my basement is a little tricky. I used to be able to do it with lights on my tables downstairs in the basement, but it was cold, it was damp. It was not a good place to start things like vegetables and tender annuals. And now my basement is a man cave. So I have no access to starting seeds down in the basement. So winter sowing really is the most ideal way for me to do this, even though I have a greenhouse at work. At my greenhouse at work is almost strictly for annuals and tropicals and overwintering big tropical plants. And so starting our perennial plants that we need for the pollinator gardens at the Park District, it's really important for us to be able to have the winter sowing method, because I can start those native seeds and those perennial seeds in the greenhouse, but keeping them alive is really challenging because it's too warm and wet inside. So if you've ever had problems starting seeds inside your house, or been just really frustrated about doing it and then having everything die from damping off disease, or had your cats running across the tables and nibbling on things, which is a regular occurrence, then this is a great way to get seed starting and not have to worry about all that. It really takes all the baggage away from it. And you're going to be reusing a lot of recyclable containers before you recycle them. So when should you start winter sowing? On the Winter Sowers Facebook page, which now has 31,000 members, I'm not a moderator or anything, but it pops up on my Facebook first thing every day. And I think that the number one question is this question: when should I start winter sowing? And frankly, you can winter sow anytime after the winter solstice. And I think you have to kind of calculate when your spring actually starts, because spring for someone in zone 7 is going to be a little bit different for spring starting for me here in the Chicagoland area for zone 5B. So you need to make that determination. But I would say for the vast majority of people who are on this talk right now, that starting in mid-December and going through mid-February is going to be good for starting your seeds. And anybody who is in zone 7 or higher, it's going to be a little bit trickier. And I don't know enough about those zones, 8 and 9. So the best place to get that information is going to be on the Facebook page, because there are so many people from all over the country. They can help you. So for me, I will start around the winter solstice, as I did that this year. Last year was the first time I did it. This year is the second time. And then I go through mid-April, and I'll explain why I do that a little bit later. And then I wondered when we should stop making jugs. When do you stop? If you're going to keep going through April, when do you stop? When does winter sowing turn into spring sowing? And Trudy had a really interesting little blurb on her website that says, stop making containers when the evenings in your area are warm enough that you don't need a jacket. You can walk around outside in just a shirt in the evening. Then it is not cold enough overnight for you to be able to winter sow, because a lot of what winter sowing has to do with, and one of the more important aspects of this, are the overnight temperatures. And we'll discuss a little bit that more later. So some of the advantages of winter sowing, very quickly: you don't need lights, you don't need tables or shelves, you don't have any risk of damping off. You do not have to harden off your seedlings, which is great, because carrying seedlings, trays of seedlings in the house and out of the house and in the house and out of the house every day or every other day, it's really what your seedlings need. They need to be hardened off, but going in and out of the house is a big pain in the butt. Trying to carry, especially if you have a lot of trays, it's just not practical. Some other advantages are that your seeds are naturally stratified, especially those that need to be stratified. And those would be things like perennials. Many native plants need to be stratified, and some hardy annuals that reseed they will benefit from being in the cold. Your seeds are going to germinate when they're supposed to. And what that means when they're supposed to is the length of day, the hours of daylight, the temperatures overnight, the temperatures during the day, and the temperature of the soil kind of has something to do with it too. So, but the temperature overnight, I think, is really one of the more important things. You don't have to water very much, but I'm not going to say you don't have to water at all. The first year that I winter sowed about 6 years ago, I did not water at all because the directions on the blog that I was following said, oh, you don't have to water at all. And I didn't have a lot of success, and I was a little disappointed. So I skipped a year and then started again and the next year and did a little bit more research, a little bit more reading from other people who had been doing it for a little bit longer. And someone had said, and Trudy does say this, if you water a little bit during the winter, then your seeds are going to germinate better. And I found that I went from, somewhere around 30 to 40% germination to almost 100% germination when I started watering. And we're going to talk about that a little later. And then your seedlings are weed-free. As long as the seed that you put into your jug is weed-free and pure seed, then you will not have any weeds in your jugs. So unless you put it under a bird feeder where the bird seed can get in. Because that has happened to me before. If I have my jugs on the deck and I have my bird feeding materials out there, sometimes I'll have safflower and sunflower dropping into my jugs, and then I'm not weed-free. So what are you going to plant? Well, you can plant almost anything that you want to. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about vegetables today, but I will touch on the vegetables a little bit. Mostly what I grow in my jugs is going to be hardy annuals, tender annuals, perennials, and included in the perennials are going to be native plants. And so my plan is usually starting in December. Somewhere between December and February, I'm going to do at least 3 sessions of winter sowing. I don't do it all in one day because I just don't have time. I work full time. I have other responsibilities, so I can't do it all in one day. If you're only doing a few jugs, you can definitely do it all in one day. So December through February, the kinds of things that I'm going to be sowing are going to be things like my columbine and hollyhock, my coneflower, my milkweed. I grow 12 species of milkweed every year, and that includes annual and native and exotic varieties. I grow blazing star, which is liatris. I grow about 4 varieties of those, 4 species. Campanula I sometimes grow. Sweet peas are great. So sweet pea is an annual that likes to be cold. And so it is okay for you to sow your sweet peas in, say, February, late February even. Foxglove is great. Lupins, I sowed lupins last year for the very first time, and they came out beautifully. Planted those plants in the ground. I'm hoping to have really nice flowers this coming summer. Balloon flower is super easy. All native grasses can be sown in the winter. And so as far as cold weather vegetables that you can do December through February, things that are cold plants like spinach, kale, Brussels sprouts, and then other things that like cold, like peas, they can be sown. And then you can sow all of your perennial herbs like thyme, oregano, and parsley. So just one little note about perennial herbs and putting seeds into those jugs. So if you're going to grow thyme and your thyme plants are just going to be for you, I would not suggest putting the entire seed packet of thyme, oregano, or parsley into one jug, because the average home gardener, home chef does not need 150 thyme plants. The average home gardener, home cook probably only needs about 3 thyme plants a year. So be very aware that when you open up a package of perennial herbs, it's going to have a lot of seeds. Do you really need every single one of those plants? Hold back some of those seeds or do 2 jugs. Share some of your plants with other people. Some of the things that I'll plant in March through April are going to be my more tender annuals. If I was going to grow impatiens, which I don't, I would not start them until April. But things in late March that I will start are cosmos and zinnia. I start marigolds and verbena bonariensis, which is the Brazilian verbena. It's a tall verbena, tall annual verbena. And then tithonia, which is Mexican sunflower. So you can see that a lot of the plants on here are pollinator plants, which is my big focus in my home garden and my gardens at work. So I concentrate mostly on those plants. As far as vegetables for March and April planting, I will continue with cool season crops if I was going to do this, including things like Asian vegetables, Asian greens like bok choy, and then you can grow beets and broccoli, Brussels sprouts, carrots. You can put your snow peas in. You can have planted those snow peas earlier or do them now. But for very tender things like basil and cilantro, you would wait until mid-April or late April to plant those jugs. And then lettuce can be started anywhere in March. So when I talk about March to April, I am talking about the third week of March through the middle of April. And for us here in the Chicagoland area, the third week of March is kind of when the weather starts to break a little bit. The days are long enough that seeds are starting to germinate in our jugs. The overnight temperatures are not in the 20s anymore. They are staying in the 30s or upper 30s. The daytime temperatures are in the 40s, at least we hope. Sometimes in late March in Chicago, it's cold, very cold. So you want to plant those things with that in mind, you know, so for your region, for your area, the city you live in, try and monitor the weather for, you know, think about what the weather has been like in the spring for the past few years. What's it like? Well, for the past few years for us in here in the Chicago area, we have gotten 20-degree temperatures overnight, at least for 2 or 3 nights in April. So if you're planting zinnia and cosmos, marigolds, and those kind of tender annuals, tithonia and things like that, you may have to cover those jugs if they have sprouted if we get very cold temperatures overnight. And we even got snow last year when we had our cold snap in April, and I had to cover my jugs, and some of my zinnias didn't survive. So hold back some seeds in your seed packages of things like zinnia, and you know, be aware that you might have to replant a couple of jugs of that in order to get those plants for yourself. And that doesn't mean that planting those in the middle of April or the end of April, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have plants in time for them to bloom for the pollinators, because they're going to be just fine. They're going to be just fine. In April, I would start really warm season vegetables like peppers and tomatoes, eggplant, squash, and pumpkin. But one little side note about peppers, peppers really like heat. And some people have really good experiences with peppers in their containers outside for winter sowing, and some people do not. So hold back some of your seeds for your peppers. Start a few inside in February or early March, but really late February is a good time to do it inside. And then start a jug in April, and then just compare, see what grows better for you. A lot of what gardening is composed of is experimentation, because we do have such a large variety of zones and growing areas in the United States and around the world, that you have to focus in on your area and decide for yourself, and by looking at the weather and talking to other gardeners, what's going to work. What not to winter sow? This is probably the number 2 question that shows up on the Facebook page all the time. And it amuses me every time when someone gets on there and says, oh, can I winter sow dahlias? Can I winter sow tulips? Winter sowing, the second word in there is sowing, and sowing means seeds. So when we're talking about fleshy seeds and tubers and things like that, like dahlias and daffodils and tulips, even raspberry canes and acorns and things like that, we don't want to winter sow those, because they will rot inside the jugs, because it's not the most appropriate growing place for them. If you want to start your dahlias early, you pot them up in pots and put them in your basement in front of a window where it's kind of warm for a few weeks before the end of the frost period for you. Tulips and daffodils, of course, they should be planted in the fall in most regions. For some regions, you can get away and get them in February and January. I think I'm talking kind of like zone 8 and up. And then raspberry canes, as soon as you get those raspberry canes and you can work the soil, throw those raspberry canes in the ground, and they're going to grow just fine. So there are some things that you don't want to winter sow, but as far as seeds go, you can sow almost any kind of seed. And then after saying that statement, then you say, okay, well, maybe one species of salvia is not going to grow as good as another species of salvia. So that's when you go on the Facebook page and ask, have you guys had experience with this seed or that seed? And should I bother with it in a jug or should I start it indoors? And everybody on the Facebook page is extremely helpful. And that's why I love being on that page. So materials that you're going to need, this is just a little picture of all the materials that you're going to need. But what I want to talk about are 1 gallon jugs first. 1 gallon jugs are my favorite container to plant in. For me, they're easy to get. I have a lot of volunteers who are willing to clean out their milk jugs and water jugs and bring them to me at work. And sometimes I feel like a junk lady because I think everybody in Oak Lawn knows that I will take a lot of their recyclables. And so I'm constantly collecting things like the milk jugs. I like the milk jugs for another reason. They act like a small greenhouse. The shoulders of the jug are sloped on most jugs. I think 90% of the jugs are sloped. And that helps with the condensation, the water recycling cycle inside the jug where you have water collecting on the top. It slides down the side of the jug, goes into the soil, feeds the plants that water, and then it evaporates again. And the hole on the top of the jug is great for letting the heat out. And the shoulders of the jug act as a flue, and it gives a route for that hot air to go out of the jug. So it's important to know that on a really sunny day like today in Chicago, it's really sunny. It's only 32 degrees. But if I walked outside my back door and took a digital thermometer gun, like you use on a grill, and if I pointed that into my jugs this afternoon, my jugs could be 60 to 70 degrees this afternoon. So they could be very, very warm. And on those kind of sunny, warm-ish days during winter, your soil will dry out. So we're going to talk about watering here in a little bit, so hold tight on that. And but I do like the jugs. But you can use a lot of other different kinds of containers. And Trudy really promotes this well, that you do not have to be stuck on one type of container. You can use anything that will let light through, and then any size that you really want to also. However, I like something that's going to give me 3 to 4 inches of soil, because most of the things that I'm growing are going to be natives. They need a pretty long root space in order to get very healthy, in order to transplant and to grow for the rest of the summer and persist after that. So keep that in mind. You want like 3 to 4 inches of soil. Now, if you are growing vegetables, you can have something that is a little bit more shallow, because theoretically, if you're planting those vegetable seeds in April for your vegetable garden, you're going to transplant them pretty quick. So I'd have to say these little tiny 1 pint soup containers are probably not going to be the best thing to grow, perennial columbine in. It's not going to be the best thing for rosin weed or cup plant or any kind of large native plant like that. But these are perfect for lettuce, rocket, and any other kind of small green that you are going to immediately transplant. The reason why these containers are not good for long-term, because the milk jugs do end up being long-term storage for my plants before I can get them transplanted. But these little containers, if you have plants growing and hitting the top of the container, and you have that condensation cycle going during the spring where you have water accumulating on the top, it's evaporating to the top of the container, it's sliding down the sides. Any foliage that is going to hit the side of the container or the lid where there is water might rot. So that's why having a container that has a little bit more headspace is better if you're going to grow something that's bigger. But I do want to stress, you can grow in anything. And there's even some information on her Facebook page about growing in plastic 1 gallon Ziploc bags. So there's a lot of choices. Don't feel stuck with just one choice. This is an alternative method of starting seeds. This is a large storage container that's probably about 18 to 24 inches tall. And these are clear solo cups in the bottom. You can use colored solo cups too. This particular photo has tomato plants in these little containers, but a few years ago, a girlfriend of mine did this and she put zinnia seeds in. And we needed zinnia plants for a specific project and they needed to be kind of big before we would plant them. And so she did this method for our large zinnia seeds and it came out really beautifully. The plants came out beautifully. So in this case, you don't have to gather as many containers. You can buy a sleeve of cups, you can buy some potting soil, and you have a big container that you have to buy and drill holes and drainage and all that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But here you have a lot more head space. So this is actually a really good container for tomatoes because they grow pretty big, pretty fast. So a list of materials that you need. This list is also going to be on a handout that you're going to get. So you don't have to furiously write down everything that I'm saying. You're going to get some information, including some plant lists that are from Trudy's website. And so you'll have those in a PDF you can put on your own computer. So some of the things that you need some kind of container to put your soil in. This can be plastic jugs, can be plastic containers. You need a paring knife. So let me just put a caveat in front of this list that this is the materials that I use. So some people might not want to use a paring knife and utility scissors to open up their jugs. They might find some other way to do it. I'm just telling you how I do it. And it's a pretty simple way to do it. But if someone else has a better way to do it and you have discovered that already, then you stick with how you're doing it because it works for you. All right, so I use a paring knife and then a utility knife. I have utility scissors, like big chicken scissors for the kitchen. I have potting soil. I just use regular potting soil. We're going to delve into that in a minute. I use duct tape and poly tape. It's two different kinds of tape. I switch back and forth. For the very first time that you're going to be winter sowing, if you're using milk jugs or some other kind of water jug, you're going to want some string or a large rubber band that can fit around your jug. And you're going to want a ruler, and I'll explain that in a minute. Plant tags are an absolute must, and plant tags can be expensive. So what I have discovered is using plastic knives. Plastic knives are really good. You can just write on the handle, and they're very, very cheap. You can get about 400 of them for, like $5 or $10 on Amazon, or Gordon Food Service or some other store. But they're really inexpensive. They might be more inexpensive for you if you're doing a large number of jugs. Spray bottle or a water bottle, and then seeds. So let's talk about soil first. So this is probably the number 3 question that is on the Facebook page all the time is what kind of potting soil? Well, you can use any type of potting soil, just normal, regular potting soil that you would use in a big pot outside if you were going to plant a big decorative pot. You would not want to use garden soil because garden soil has weed seeds in it. And I'm not talking about bagged garden soil. I'm talking about garden soil from your garden. That garden soil is going to have weed seeds in it. It's going to have fungi in it. That might not be good for your plants and could have other things in it that are not good for your plants, other bacteria and things like that. So I like using a bagged potting soil because it's relatively sterile. The one thing that you need to really try and avoid is the potting soil that has water crystals in it. And the water crystals are very problematic because they hold too much moisture, and it can get very annoying to have all that moisture in there because it will just outrightly kill your seedlings. Your jugs need to drain well, and those polymer crystals are going to hold on to too much water. And the other thing that you don't need in your potting soil is fertilizer. Seedlings do not need fertilizer until they are getting their first and second mature sets of leaves. And by that time, you should be transplanting. So your potting soil should be light enough to drain well. Your seed starting mix, if you buy specific seed starting mix, that is for starting seeds indoors, in a greenhouse. It dries out really fast. These are for people who are starting things inside and are going to water daily. And so avoid the seed starting mix. Although some people have had some experience with it and have been happy with it. So again, if you have found this and you like it and you use it, then stick with it. You don't have to do what I say just because I say it, because believe me, I've made my own mistakes with this method. You guys are benefiting from all of my mistakes. So that's what this is all about. So if your jugs remain too wet during the whole winter and spring period, and there's fertilizer in the soil, you're going to be growing a lot of algae, and the algae will kill your seedlings. It will suppress your seeds and keep things from germinating. So you want to avoid getting algae. Okay, so we're going to pause for a moment. We're going to take some questions.
Yes, so I will ask the questions that have come in the chat so far.
Okay, because I can't see the chat right now.
Yeah, I saved them because there were quite a few that came in.
Okay.
So first off, what is the flower on the first slide? The purple flower?
On the first slide?
Yeah.
That's a flower called Salsaglossus. It's painted tongue, and it's an annual, and it is a nice bee plant. It's not native, but it's a very cool plant. I absolutely love the colors on them. There's multicolor mix that you can get, or you can get just the purple.
Wonderful, thank you. What does it mean by a seed being stratified?
Stratification is when a seed needs to go through a short or long period of cold temperatures in order to germinate later. So traditionally, if I was going to stratify seeds in the house to grow things at work in my greenhouse, I would start off with just a little sandwich baggie with a little bit of moist sand. I'd put my seeds in it, kind of roll it up so it looks like a little hot dog, mark it, and I would put it in the refrigerator for 3 to 6 weeks. So stratification can be really quick. It can be very long. Most of the time, 3 to 6 weeks is enough time. So when we're winter sowing, we're putting our seeds out between December and February, and things are germinating at the end of March and the beginning of April for us in this region in the Midwest. And so that is plenty of cold stratification time. So even if you go over those 3 months, that's fine. You're not doing any harm to the seed.
Great. How do you know when to water?
We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes, so hang tight on that question.
Can you, for the tape around the gallon jug, can you use cheap clear packing tape? Does it hold up through the winter?
It does not. It detaches from the container. So we're going to talk about taping and closing containers in a minute. You guys are so eager. You're getting ahead of yourself.
Will hollyhock, when winter sown, bloom the first year?
No, it always blooms the second year because hollyhock is a biennial. You cannot trick it. No matter what you do, you cannot trick hollyhock. You have to wait. So if you love hollyhocks and you want them every year, it would behoove you to start seeds every single year. And then you get on a schedule of having flowers every year. That's how you get around that.
What is recommended soil potting mix?
Well, as a master gardener and a representative of the extension, I'm not supposed to talk about brand names. I will say that right now I'm using a private mix soil this year that I get from my local garden center, nursery, not garden center. And this nursery makes their own potting mix, and I can go in there and buy it in I think a 20-pound bag or something like that. And so I'm using that this year. I have a private label potting soil that I use in my greenhouse. Sometimes I use, there's one brand that I really don't like that I shouldn't mention, but I think most of you probably know what that brand is. And I just don't think it's a very high quality potting soil. However, a lot of people do have a good experience with it. There's a brand at Menards that I really like that comes in organic formula and non-organic formula. It's very good. Basically, you don't have to be super choosy with your potting mix. Avoid potting mix that has real soil in it, though. I have used that one year, and I had algae. Every single jug that I used, that real topsoil-based potting soil, in every jug that I used it in, it had algae growing in it. So it was not suitable for this. So you want peat moss based potting soil mix that has perlite in it. It can have vermiculite in it. It should have a little bit of maybe some pine bark in it. It can have a little bit of compost in it. And basically, if you open up that bag and it doesn't have enough little white specks in it, you know, not enough perlite in it that you think that, oh, geez, is this gonna drain well or not? You know, get an extra bag of perlite, a little bag of perlite, and add a little extra perlite in it. Because I think the drainage factor is more important than being worried about them drying out. You don't want them to get drowned. I hope that answered your question.
I think so. And I think it answered a couple of other soil related questions too. In the case of cucumbers and squash, can you sow them directly in the garden and cover with the top of a jug to avoid having to transplant?
Yeah, you can do that. That's called a cloche. And you can use the top. Oh, actually, I have one right here. You can use the top of a clear water bottle. This is a 1 gallon water jug. And I do sow in these. You can see I cut it already. But you can use just the top as a cloche if you put some seeds in the garden directly and you stick a piece of bamboo through the hole. So yeah, you can do that. Cucumbers are normally sown directly into the garden unless you're going to go buy little seedlings at a garden center. For the most part at the community garden, we're going to plant things like squash and cucumbers out in the garden directly.
Great. Someone had a question about worrying about growing food in plastic. Is there any research into this or any concerns?
Well, that's Becca's place, the research part. I don't know if there's any research, but I don't think anybody has ever found any problems with growing food plants in plastic. Plastic is generally pretty stable. It doesn't leach. So I just really have never heard of anybody having any problems with this. Most bottles that we drink of nowadays do not have BPA in them, and BPA would be the problematic chemical that used to be in bottles. And I don't think that any bottles put it in there anymore. So that's what you would have to watch out for. Rebecca, am I right?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good answer. And then also, I mean, a lot of our seed starting trays, like if you do indoor seed starting, are plastic anyway. So it just seems to be like the method that we use. And anything that you got that is food safe, like it was intended for milk or it was intended for salad greens or ice cream, it's going to be food safe anyway.
Yeah, water bottles, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you mentioned, so is potting soil the same as potting mix? So that I'm assuming that means something you can buy like potting mix in the store. And that's a yes.
Yep. I would say they're basically the same thing. Some bags are going to say potting mix and some bags are going to say potting soil. I have never found a significant difference between the two. So I don't think there is.
And a question about the method using solo cups, such as for tomatoes. How do you cover it? And does the top need to be vented?
Okay, so what you would do with that large storage container is use a drill and very carefully put many drainage holes on the bottom of the container, the big storage container. You would have to use a very, very little fine Dremel tool or a very small drill bit and make holes in the bottom of the solo cup. It's pretty brittle. If you use real solo cups, it's pretty brittle plastic and they will crack. So you have to figure out a way to, you can even burn a hole in it with a soldering iron. So you have to have drainage holes in the cups and the big container. And the lid of the container has to have vent holes across the top. So those would have to be a little bit bigger and you should be good to go then. So for that method, it is a lot of drilling and burning or cutting holes. But in the end, you might end up with stronger tomato plants or stronger zinnias or, whatever you want to. And, not everybody has access to milk jugs. I've seen that quite a bit. And you know what, for those of you in Canada, you can probably back this up. You guys in Ontario, I know for sure, buy your milk in bags and milk does not come in a jug. So it's kind of like the whole milk jug thing is a non-issue up in Canada, I think. You guys can back that up and tell us in the chat whether that's true or not.
A couple other questions if we have time. How are we on time, Dolly?
I think we're okay.
Okay. Do we have to pre-moisten the soil before taping up the containers?
Yes, we're going to talk about that in a minute. So from
Um,
now on, we're going to go through all the steps of starting the containers.
Someone asked, can I throw my seeds out on the snow-covered ground? I don't really know.
With certain seeds, it's recommended to do that, and specifically poppy seeds are recommended to do that. They really, poppy seeds and radish are two things that are not always recommended to winter sow, because putting them out on the snow and letting them melt down into your garden soil is their preferred method, because they like being very cold and they just ride the snow down into the soil. So those are just two things that I know of that are probably better.
I did not know that. The person who asked that question must have known more than I did about because I was like, I don't understand. That's awesome. So great. How do you address emergent seedlings and frost?
Well, any frost that we get after the seedlings germinate in the jugs, they should be well protected in the jugs. However, if the temperatures go down below about 25 and you have seedlings that are not natives, you have seedlings that are tender annuals, that's when you have to cover them. Now, if I had jugs that had seedlings and for some reason we went down below like 15 degrees, 10 degrees, or below zero, those jugs that have sprouted, I would put into my garage. But the jugs that have not sprouted in sub-zero temperatures, they're fine. They can just stay outside. None of that is going to hurt them. The jugs will freeze solid probably for a day or two, and that's not going to hurt them.
Okay, so if sprouted below zero, put inside. If not sprouted, they're fine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. And then a favorite marking device for tags.
Oh, I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Cool. How can you calculate the amount of soil needed for your number of gallon jugs?
Gonna talk about that in a minute.
Awesome. Do you have to, is there a point where you have to change from seed starting mix to soil, or just when you transplant?
Just when you transplant. Yeah. And transplanting can go directly from the jug into the garden, or it can go from the jug to a small little transplant pot to the garden. It depends on what you want to do. We'll talk about that at the very end. You guys are so smart. You're asking all the right questions.
And then would you recommend a few hole punches, and then a thread tying together the milk jug instead of taping for increased airflow, I'm assuming?
You can do that. And I have a photo of that coming up.
Cool.
It can work out really well.
Just double checking, make sure we got everyone. If there's no snow for stratification, can you throw poppy seeds out on a rainy day?
Do what? Wait, read that one more time.
If there's no snow, can you throw poppy seeds out on a rainy day?
Oh, just throw the seeds in the garden?
I'm assuming if anyone wants
for the poppy, probably the poppy and radish seeds. Yeah, you can do that as long as it's still cold. You can put them out with no snow. Yeah, they prefer the snow, but you can do it without snow.
Cool. Okay, I think that's all the questions that came in. If we missed your question, feel free to type it in the chat again. Or Renee, feel free to forward that up to me. And we'll have another time for questions at the end. So at the end, yeah. We're gonna continue on with the presentation. Thank you so much, Dolly.
You're welcome. Okay, so let's go through all the steps of making a container. So number one, the first thing you want to do, if your container has had anything in it other than water, you want to clean it. So for my bottles here that I have sitting next to me, they've had distilled water in them, so I would not worry about cleaning them as much as a milk jug. Sometimes my friends who bring me milk jugs, they'll rinse them out in hot water, but they don't quite get it all. And if the milk jug sits with a lid on it, oh my God. So those should be cleaned out with hot water and some dish soap and a little bit of bleach. If it really smells bad, you can leave the mixture in there for 10 or 20 minutes. But plan ahead and allow your jugs to dry out for a day or two on their own before you start cutting into them and preparing to plant. because it's easier for cutting, and it's less messy if it's not wet, and you don't have water dripping all over you. I usually do this actually in my living room. I'm doing this. I'm very, very careful, or I'm doing it on my kitchen counter. So just let them dry out ahead of time. That way you can also tell whether or not you've cleaned it enough. If it dries and it still smells a little, got to clean it again. The next thing you're going to do is put in your drainage holes. Try to remember to always do drainage holes first, because it's really hard to put drainage holes in after you have cut your jug apart if you are using jugs. So the way I do my drainage holes on the bottom of the jug, you can see in the photo, I take a sharp little paring knife and I just make a V cut, and then I pull that little plastic tab back, or I use the knife and I push that little plastic tab in, and I make about 4, maybe 5 on a jug, and that's enough drainage. It's super easy. You can also use a soldering iron and you can burn little holes in. You can use an ice pick. You can use a slotted screwdriver that's kind of clean and sharp and new, because milk jug material is really easy to get through. However, once you start using things like clear milk jugs, like this one I got lemonade in, this is a little bit more rigid, and so is the other jug that I showed you. So using a paring knife and making those holes in the bottom, I doubt if you can see this, but I can stick my finger in it. With this kind of rigid plastic, using the paring knife works pretty good. Burning might be a little easier. I just don't like the smell of burning plastic, so that's why I started doing the paring knife part. You can also use a drill. If you're real careful, you can use a drill. So drainage holes first, you can see that I drew a line on my jug, and the line is where I'm going to cut. The way I made that line was I put a rubber band around the jug just below the handle. I wish I had turned this jug around when I took the photo. And then I measured it at 4 inches. And so 4 inches on a milk jug is about where the handle sits from the tabletop up. And that's how much soil that we need. So when you do go to cut, you need to make sure on a jug that you do not cut through the handle of the milk jug, so that you do end up having a hinge, so that you don't have to try and wrestle the lid of this container back onto the bottom of the container. So the hinge is really useful for just making things really easy. Plus, once you tape up the jug, you'll be able to use the handle to actually move the jugs around. An alternate method of cutting jugs open that's a little bit more easy is just cutting a 4-inch long by 3 or 4-inch wide hole in the front. You keep a flap either on the top or the bottom. So you're just making a window into your jug, and then you can put soil in. So the soil, getting the soil into this jug using this method is a little bit more, a little harder, a little bit more cumbersome, but you're not doing as much cutting and you don't have to do as much taping. So for some people, this is going to be a good method. And when you do tape it up, all I did was use one piece of tape across the bottom there. You can kind of see the shadow of the tape, because of course I use clear tape and not duct tape. Here's that other method I found. I found this on the Facebook page last night. So if that person is on here, thanks a bunch. That was you, Stacy? All right, this is really cool. So Stacy cut her jug apart, and she put in 2 holes, and she tucked the top of the jug into the bottom of the jug and tied it closed. And I think that's really cool. It's going to be good for taking your jugs apart later. It's going to be so much easier for you. So if you don't want to wrestle the tape or pay for the tape, because tape can be kind of expensive, then this is a good method. I like this. It's really simple. All right, some tips for success. When you're putting your jugs together, I usually am doing this class that you guys are in right now. I'm usually doing this class in person in a 2-hour workshop with jugs and potting soil and seeds and people with knives and scissors all over the place. And one of the things that we do is we put coffee filters in the bottom of the containers so that we do not make a mess in our multi-purpose rooms where we're doing this. And the coffee filter just, it kind of plugs the holes temporarily and keeps the soil from falling through if it's a little too dry. And then also when I put my jugs out in the garden, if I'm putting the jugs on bare soil, if I'm putting the jugs on the patio, then the coffee filter seems to keep slugs from getting inside. If you have a problem with slugs in your garden, as soon as those plants start to germinate and you have little tender seedlings in there and you have slugs, the slugs can climb up the little hole and they're going to climb up the side of your container and they're going to eat your plants. So the coffee filter, for some reason, seems to deter them. So a large coffee filter is going to be good. I just lay it in the bottom. Okay, so filling your containers. So a friend of mine and I started my containers before Christmas, and we measured the potting soil before we put it in. We measured how much we used, and this is what we came up with. And let me see if I can remember it correctly, because I don't think I typed it in here. Okay, so what we found out was that a milk jug takes 8 cups of soil. Okay, so this will help you calculate what you need. And then a bushel of soil, which is how I bought my soil, is 38 quarts of soil. And most of the time, potting soil is sold in 38 to 40 quart bags. So the 38 quart bags that I bought filled 22 jugs. It was almost perfect. So 8 cups of soil and a 38 quart bag of soil will fill 22 milk jugs. Now, when you fill the soil into your milk jugs, I would suggest putting your fingers in there, or a spoon, or your scissors, and just kind of work the soil a little bit with your fingers and get the air out of the soil. Don't tamp it down. Don't knuckle it down, but just get the air out of the soil, tap your container on the tabletop, let it sink down a little bit, and add a little bit more soil. And even when we did do that, it was still about 8 cups. So you're going to get the air out and you're going to add a little bit more. So the reason why this is important is if you leave very fluffy soil that is in your containers, you sow your seeds, but the soil is a little too dry, when you do go to water in a week or two, when they need water, or when you water right before you close up the containers, the soil is going to sink and you're going to end up with only about 2 inches of soil. And that's not enough soil for most plants. So get the air out of your soil, add a little bit more soil, make sure you have that 3 to 4 inches of soil in there. And then I do recommend watering this soil the day before or a few hours before you start your project, so that everything gets hydrated in that big container of soil. Sphagnum peat is the #1 ingredient in most of our bagged potting soils in the country. And sphagnum peat is something that we call hydrophobic. So once it dries out, it takes 3 times more water to rehydrate it than it does just to keep it evenly moist over a long period of time. So that's not to say that you shouldn't use sphagnum peat potting soil, because it's kind of in the United States, this is what we have available to us. But just make sure you water that soil the day before or several hours before you're going to start filling your containers, so that you are not trying to water a little bit later on after you put seeds in, because I'll explain why that's going to be a mess in a minute. So water your seeds, water your soil, add your seeds, make sure you have enough soil in the containers, and then plant your seeds. So how many seeds is too many seeds? So this is a question that I get all the time. These are hollyhock seeds in this photo, and this is probably a few too many hollyhock seeds in this photo, but this just shows you that you can put a lot of seeds in a container. The rule of thumb seems to be, though, the larger the seed, the larger the plant is going to be, the fewer the seeds. So this is probably a really bad example photo. So the larger the seed, the fewer the seeds, because it's going to be a bigger plant. But I usually do whatever seed I am planting, I am usually covering the whole soil layer except for the outside rim. You can see I kind of held back because sometimes the soil shrinks away. We don't want seeds slipping down the side. So just keep them kind of concentrated in the middle. And the reason why I do sow my seeds so heavily is because most of these jugs I'm taking to work to my greenhouse at the beginning of May, in the middle of May, and we are transplanting them right away. So I can transplant them before they get too big, they get root bound, they get unhappy, and they start getting weak. If you have that capability of transplanting very quickly, then you can sow heavily. If you don't, if you anticipate that this is going to be something where, oh my gosh, I might have to wait until June, I might have to wait until July to do some of these native plants, so sow less. This is what one of my jugs usually looks like. This is about 100 seeds in here. This is balloon milkweed. I planted this on March 13th of 2019. This photo was probably taken the second week of May. And this is when I was going to get ready to transplant these little guys. And I'll talk about transplanting in a few minutes. So if this was for my house, I definitely don't need 100 balloon milkweed seeds at my house. So if I was going to make this jug for my house, for my own personal use, I probably would only have about 10, maybe 20 at the most, you know, use a few for my garden, give a few away. So that's probably a good way to think about it too. Okay, so labeling your jug. You can see in this photo, there is a marker sitting on my counter. That marker is called a garden marker, the garden marker. This is the marker that I use at work. I've been using this marker for about 15 years, ever since I started my job at the Park District and had the greenhouse. We looked and looked and looked for a UV resistant marker and found that out of all the ones that I've ever tried, this is the best one. It holds up the best. You don't have to use this marker though. They're about $4 or $5 a piece, so they're a little pricey. You can use a China marker, you know, one of those grease pencils. You can use just regular Sharpie on duct tape and put the duct tape on the bottom of your container. That's what Trudy does. Works out really well for her. The marker does not fade. You can write on the container directly. You can write on the duct tape on the front of the container directly. But whatever it is that you are going to do, I would say you should also have a label on the inside of the container. Remember, I was talking about the plastic knives or any other kind of little plastic label. You should have a label on the inside, because eventually you're going to cut the lid off of this jug and discard it, recycle it, and there goes the name of your plant if you do not have a tag inside the jug. So make sure you tag it twice. You're going to tag everything twice. Let's see what else. So again, the garden marker is what I really like. Oh, you can use paint markers. One of the things about marking the outside of your jug and actually writing on the jug that's important is actually making sure that the plastic is very dry on the outside. It's really hard to put the tape on, and it's really hard to write on the jugs if they're at all damp on the outside. So make sure they're dry. As you can see, down in this bottom picture, I put the name of the plant. Sometimes I'll put the botanic name and the common name, and then I always put the date of when I put the seeds in the jug and tape the jug up, the day that I made the jug. Because then I also keep a notebook with the names of all the plants by date when I have sown them and put them outside, because then I like to monitor when they germinate. So labeling is really important. So if you're going to be like a prepper, or you're doing a lot of vegetables, or you're doing a very large project, I mean, on average, I am planting about 150 jugs a year, because I'm using these plants at home. I am using them at work. I'm using them at work to plant. I'm using them at work for plant sale. Sometimes we use them for the Master Gardener projects. So I'm making a lot of jugs. So if we lost all the labeling for all these jugs, this is not my picture, by the way, but if we lost all the labeling for these jugs, we'd really be in trouble. We would have to wait for all these plants to get opened and to grow a little bit in order to find out what everything is. And if you do find out that you missed something and you don't know what it is, and oh my God, what is the seedling? I don't know what it is. I don't remember what I planted. Having that notebook helps. And then having everything written down helps. And then also just wait it out for a couple of weeks. Once those plants start getting their second set of leaves, their mature leaves, then you're going to be able to identify it yourself, or pop it up on a Facebook page and say, hey, do you guys know what this is? But if you put on just tiny little seedling, most tiny little seedlings look a lot alike. So labeling is super important. The person in this slide used popsicle sticks, I think, for some of their labeling. Popsicle sticks are a little problematic because most markers will run on them once they get wet, and they rot really quickly. So if you think that your plants are going to have to stay in the jugs for, you know, the most of the summer for whatever reason, then a popsicle stick is probably going to rot. So tape your jug up. I use 2 different kinds of tape for taping my jugs. I use this tape from Ace hardware store called Poly Tape. So this is not just clear shipping tape. This is a very specific sunlight and water resistant plastic tape that I have found very useful because it's clear, it's not duct tape, it's not obscuring any sunlight. But then I also use duct tape and I find that I have just the same results also. This tape is a little bit expensive, but it's kind of fun to have the jugs just have all the sunlight available to these jugs as possible. So this tape is kind of cool for that. If you're going to use the poly tape though, you're going to need a long handled spoon, and you put your tape on like in 2 pieces around your jug, and then you put your hand on the outside of the jug and you use the spoon on the inside and you just smooth it out to make it stick really well. And once it sticks really well, it shouldn't come off. Duct tape is good though too, and you can use, I've used all different kinds of duct tape. You can use really cheap stuff, really expensive stuff. It doesn't seem to matter with the duct tape. It holds up really well. Okay, and then after you tape up your jugs, you make sure they're labeled. You make sure you have everything written down in your notebook or on a piece of paper or whatever you're going to do. Then you can just put them outside. And I like to put my plants out on a southern, eastern, western type exposure. This is on my deck. This is southwest exposure for most of the day, but on my patio where I also put jugs, that is southeast exposure. And yes, they're supposed to be covered by snow. The snow helps water them. The snow insulates them. Just leave them alone. You don't have to sweep them off. Don't uncover them. Just leave them alone. In the spring, however, when you do start opening up your jugs, if you do have your jugs in a place where you could possibly have flooding, it's important for those jugs to be elevated. So this was a weekend in 2020. I believe it was, I think it was late May, early June, and we just had this torrential downpour for a long time. And my deck boards on my deck are butted up so close to each other, that was a mistake that I made, that it can hold water. And so I had to, luckily I was home and I had to dash out and I had to put all these guys on top of trays that were inverted to keep them from drowning. So keep that in mind too. Once you open them, you know, are they going to get planted that day, or are you going to wait a little while, let them get a little bit stronger, let them stand up a little bit more? Some of these I opened up just a day or 2 before, so they look a little shocky. They look a little shocky from the sun, which is totally normal. But a lot of them were just starting to germinate, and had I let them just get completely drowned, they wouldn't have germinated. So keep that in mind. Watering your jugs. So the person in this photo, this is a photo that I borrowed. They use 2-liter jugs, which is a totally appropriate container. However, if I was going to use a 2-liter jug, I probably wouldn't have put as many seeds in it as this person did. Of course, this could be like lettuce seeds or something like that, in which case it doesn't really matter because you're going to pop those out in little clumps anyway. But if I was going to put perennials in here, I'd make it thinner. But the 2-liter jugs, you can see the ones that still have the lids on them, they are wet on the inside of the top, and that is condensation. That is water that has evaporated from the soil. It has hit the top of the jug, and it is now going to do that condensation cycle where it's going to slide down the side of the jug and be used by the plant. At a certain point, if you're not inputting more moisture into the soil will get used up, the container will dry out. And especially if you have a lot of sunny days, we'll do that. So how do you water? And when do you water? I'll tell you right now, I only water my jugs about 7 or 8 times during the whole winter. And I water them when the temperature gets above 35 and it's very, very sunny. And those jugs look like they are changing color. They're getting lighter. The soil is looking drier. When you pick up the jugs, you can kind of feel that they're lighter and that they need water, but your biggest clue is going to be that the condensation on the top of your jug is gone. It's been used. So what do I use to water? I use a water bottle and I cut holes. I use a needle actually to make holes into the cap to make a little watering jug. So if you use just a regular watering jug with a stream of water and you put that stream of water down the hole of your winter sowing jug, it is going to make a hole in the middle. It's going to disrupt all of your seeds, and you're going to have some big problems in there when it comes to germination time. So watering as if it's a little shower is a lot better. This is like 100% better. I've tried to use spray bottles in the past, and I kind of have arthritis in my hands, and so it's too painful to do that to 150 jugs. So using a little device like this is much, much easier. So what I use to make these is just a water bottle. I usually use 1 liter water bottles. I have about a dozen of them that I've just saved over the years and accumulated. I use a candle or a stovetop, pair of gloves, and a large needle, like a large needle this would be a needle for like upholstery or for repairing knitting. It's a really big fat needle with a big eye. And I just heat up the tip of that needle and put the tip of the needle into the tip of the cap, just like in this photo, and make about 20 to 25 holes in the cap. And then you have a watering container. Now this cap is going to match up with the hole on the top of your jugs, which is kind of nice and makes it really easy. And then all I have to do is just invert the bottles and just squeeze a little bit and the water comes out. So if this works, you should be able to see a video.
We can see the video. It's a little choppy, but
Is it? Okay.
can still see it. Yeah.
All right. And when I water, hopefully you guys can see this. When I water, I don't just squeeze the water down into the jug. I'm going to squeeze it in a way that the water is going to go down the sides of the jug. No matter what you use to water, the water should go down the sides of the jug in order to not disrupt your seeds. That's mostly the point of it.
Oh.
Okay. All right, so what to expect in the next few weeks? So you've gotten your jugs done, they're outside, they're getting snowed on, they're getting rained on, they're getting nice and cold. Germination is going to be different for every species of plant that you have planted. So if you have planted 150 different kinds of plants, they are not all going to germinate in the same week. Cold hardy plants are going to germinate earlier. And then and they're going to germinate when winter starts transitioning into spring. And just like I mentioned before, for us in Chicago, that's about the 3rd week of March for us. It's an average. And this is when the overnight temperatures are warming up to above the 20s into the 30s on a regular basis. Daytime temperatures can fluctuate between 38 and 55, but the nighttime temperatures are always consistently in the high 30s. And then we're having more and more hours of daylight. And those are the 2 things that trigger. So this is swamp milkweed that I planted on January 1st of 2020. I planted this in a large cat litter container. If you need a lot of one type of plant for a big project of some sort, a large cat litter container is really useful because you can put a lot into it. The hole is very large, it's easy to water. And these little swamp milkweed plants came up absolutely beautifully. There was about 200 seeds in here. So when the days are still cool, the nights the days are cool but warming up, and the nights are very cold still, and you're getting a lot of light, about 10 to 11 hours. Well, no, actually at that time of the year, probably 9 hours of light. That's when they're going to start germinating. And then after that, you're going to think about opening your containers. So once we hit the end of April in this area and the beginning of May, then I'll open up the jugs on warm days to try and increase the germination. If they're a little bit wet, this helps them dry out a little bit. They get a little bit of sun, they get a little bit of extra air. And then at night, I just fold all the containers closed and I push them together into groups, and that holds the lids on. You do not have to retape your containers at this point once you reopen them. And that's my outdoor cat Ginger there helping me out. He was actually kind of freaking out when I started opening these containers. He didn't know what was going on. So on the day when I decide that I'm ready to open all of the containers, this is what my deck looks like. It's a really small deck. I bring my little red stool out, I put some music on, I let my other cat come outside and sit on the porch with me. And I take the tape and put that in the trash, and all the tops of the containers, if I am not going to keep the clear tops to use as cloches in my vegetable garden at work, then they all get recycled. And so this is what it looks like. It's kind of like mayhem. It takes a few hours to do this because it's a lot of jugs, but it's usually kind of a nice relaxing thing to do too. And so things are going to look, every species is going to look really different. You know, the Liatris in the middle there was only half germinated, and the Verbena histata on the right, I overdid it with the seed on there. And the little seedlings that never developed down in the front of that jug, I never used because they were just not developed, but the ones in the back I did use. It's not a rare seed. It's not a precious seed. There's plenty of it. I have lots of it at home. I have lots of plants at home. So you don't have to use every single seedling unless it's a very expensive seed that you have sown. So just keep that in mind. And as you go through spring, it just keeps looking better and better. And then you need to think about transplanting. So there's a couple of different methods that Trudy has taught us. And one of those is the taffy method. So these are my echinacea seedlings. So this is going to be for a little bit larger seedlings that you're going to use. And what you do is you put your hand over the plants on your container after you've taken the top off, and you invert that container, and then you put it back right without the bottom on it. So I usually do this over a big barrel of soil or some other kind of bin of soil, and I can just rest the whole root ball there. And then the taffy method part of it is that I'm just pulling apart small clumps of plants in 3s and 5s, and then I'm transplanting them into pots. So for me, most of my little seedlings are going to go into pots first because I'm using them for projects. But if you were going to do this and plant all of these echinacea seeds out in one day in the garden, then you would pull them apart in little groups of 2s and 3s and put them directly into the garden. So you would do all of this opening up, and you tear your plants apart very gently, put them on a tray. You take that tray out in the garden with you, and you have your little plugs of seedlings. The next method is the brownie method, and this is something that I would use for much smaller seedlings, things like herbs. The photo here has oregano herbs in here, little seedlings of oregano. And like I said at the very beginning, be careful how much you do with your herbs, because there's a lot of oregano in here, and no one needs this much oregano if they're just doing a little bit of cooking at home. So keep in mind that oregano will take over your yard. Thyme will take over your yard. You don't want that to happen, so be conservative with those seeds. But if you're doing it to give it away, use for a plant sale, share with other people, you can take your oregano or your other little seedlings out, put them on something hard, and just divide them up into little squares like you would brownies in a pan. And then you end up with little plugs that are about 1 to 2 inches in diameter. Each little plug will have several plants in it, and you can pot them up or you can put them in the garden. So the brownie method is about cutting into little containers, into little chunks of seedlings. So when I'm potting up my seedlings, the ones that are going to go for the plant sale or the plant giveaways at work are going to be planted up in 2 or 4 inch pots. These are little 2.5 inch pots. And they'll get put outside because they're already hardened off. I don't have to keep them in the greenhouse. We'll take them to the greenhouse to separate and pot them up. And at this point, fertilizer goes into the soil. I use a pelleted slow release fertilizer, and they go directly back outside into my storage area, my plant area. So one really important reminder, especially for those of you who are new to this method, not all seeds are going to germinate at the same time. Okay, so we've established that, but not all of them are going to germinate by May also, which is usually the time that we're looking to plant plants. There's going to be certain varieties of seeds that are just going to take a little bit longer. And in that case, you take the tops off of the jugs, you put those little jugs into someplace that's nice and sunny. And at this point, you're going to water them just like you would any other kind of nursery container that you have brought in to your home, into your garden, and wait until they're big enough, until they germinate and they're big enough to plant. So this is Echinacea tennesseensis in this little container here in the front. And they didn't quite germinate all the way when the top was on the jug. And so after I took the jug off, this was, I don't know how many days this was later, but they immediately started to germinate as soon as they were opened up and exposed to the air and extra sun and a little bit more heat. And they did start germinating, and they did a pretty good job. And the purple prairie clover behind it too did the same thing. So I usually have problems with this with columbine. Columbine sometimes takes forever to germinate. And then other species of columbine will germinate just fine over the winter. And then common milkweed also takes a long time to germinate. If you throw common milkweed out in the garden, it can take 2 years to germinate if the seeds don't disappear. But if you do it in a jug, they could germinate over, at that later part of the winter, but then maybe not. And then when you open up the jug, you're like, oh my God, I put 100 seeds in here. Why is there only 4 plants? Well, those 100 seeds are going to germinate slowly over the whole summer. So don't throw those jugs away. It's very important. That's my point. Don't throw your jugs away so fast. I usually don't throw any jugs away until September. I'll clean them out and recycle the bottoms. So a word about fertilizer. Your seedlings don't need fertilizer while they're in the jugs. They don't need it until they're being transplanted. So I like slow release pellets, and organic fertilizers that are liquid are really well too. They work really well too. And if you're going to use any kind of fertilizer that you're going to mix with water, do not do it 100% strength. Don't do it 50% strength. The first time you fertilize your plants, it should be 25% strength. More fertilizer is not better. More fertilizer equals your plants being burned, especially with synthetic fertilizer and not organic. So fertilize every 10 to 14 days after you've potted these things up, just to get them started, but do it at a very, very low rate of fertilizer. It will be much better for your plants. Your plants are going to be much stronger for it. So what is spring sowing? We have bantered around on the Facebook page about spring sowing a little bit. Spring sowing is just sowing mostly your very, very tender annuals and tender vegetables after the middle of April. And you're doing this when the temperatures are heating up in the spring. And so the only difference that I have ever seen that Trudy has suggested is to put more vent holes in the top of your jug, because it is warmer outside. Your jugs are going to be hotter inside. And so the extra holes are needed to vent. So you can see that in here. And I have, when you get your handouts, one of the handouts is going to be spring sowing. You can also do spring sowing for native plants in anticipation of doing a fall planting of native plants. So that will work out. Now, what do you do if you just don't ever plant your jugs? So in 2020, in the spring last year, I was puttering around in my patio and I noticed I had about 12 containers that I just kind of scooted together into a clump the winter before. These are jugs that I planted in the winter of 18-19, left over the summer in 2019. And then in 2020, I said, oh my God, these containers all sprouted. So now I had 2-year-old native plants. I had golden Alexanders, I had some rosinweed, I had purple prairie clover, echinaceas, milkweeds, liatris, and they were absolutely gorgeous. Now, it's not to say that if you forget to sow some or forget to plant something, you deliberately leave them in the jug over the winter. I'm not saying that it's always going to live, but what I am saying is that my patio is a nice little microclimate that is probably about zone 6, almost zone 7. It's really warm back there because it's enclosed, and they lived over the winter and they resprouted, and I got really beautiful second-year native plants. So don't always be so disappointed with yourself that you haven't gotten something planted. put those pots, put those containers somewhere where it's protected. And they were on the floor of my patio, so they got plenty of moisture from the snow just kind of melting on my patio. And so they did really well. So again, experiment. Gardening is all about experimentation. So let's review some concepts. Some of the advantages, again, of winter sowing is that it's very hands-off. Once you make your containers, you don't have to maintain your seedlings or your trays with lights and water daily. I think it's a very laid back way of gardening for seedlings. And one of the best things is if you have pets, you don't have pets all up in your plants. Collect your supplies now. If you haven't started collecting any supplies, start collecting now. If you need milk jugs, check out your dentist's office. They use distilled water for their sterilization machine. Check out coffee shops that use 1 gallon jugs of milk for making lattes and things like that. But be warned that if you do approach Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and places like that, they don't have a lot of space in the back of their store to store these things. So make sure that you are arranging this on a day where you are available to go and maybe pick up these jugs twice in one day, so that you don't irritate them and make an enemy of them, and then you don't get any jugs ever again. Believe me, that's happened to me in the past. You forget about jugs and they have a gigantic garbage bag full of jugs and they're not crushed and they're waiting for you, and then you don't show up and they get kind of upset. So make sure you're available to do this maybe twice in a day, maybe 1 or 2 days in a row, and you should have enough jugs for whatever you need to do. Other supplies that you should collect ahead of time is make sure you decide what kind of tape you need, get your tools together that you're going to use. It's really important to collect them ahead of time. Don't try and scramble and get everything ready in one day. I just have a big box or a bin and I just start collecting stuff. And now that I do this workshop 1 or 2 times a year, I sort of have like a Foot Locker and I keep all the supplies in Foot Locker because I'm doing it so many times. Choose the right potting soil, something that drains well, something that does not have water crystals. No fertilizer is preferred. But in the end, if you can only find one type of fertilizer or one type of potting soil and you want to winter sow, then winter sow. Okay, just do it. If it does have the water crystals in it, buy extra perlite, give your potting soil a little bit extra drainage, and hopefully everything will be okay. Don't ever think that if you're not using the potting soil that everyone else is using, that you can't do this. Don't ever think that. The more often you do this, the more years you get into it, the more jugs you make, you're going to find out things that work for you. But when you're starting out, do your best to find the best materials to use, but don't ever feel bad that you don't have the same thing everybody else does. What are you going to grow and how much of it are you going to grow? So be very realistic. What do I need these hollyhocks for? How much space do I have in my garden for these hollyhocks? Am I going to share these hollyhocks with my friends? Am I going to donate them to a plant sale for the garden club? How many do I actually need? Should I be putting 150 seeds into a container? So really be very realistic about what your needs are. Water your containers. Like I said, I only water 7 to 8 times during the season. I haven't even watered the 20 or 40 jugs that I have outside yet. Probably this weekend I'll have to because it's sunny outside today. So water your containers. You're going to have better germination rate if you water your containers. Out of 140 jugs that I did last year, I had in the end, at the very end by June, I only had 1 jug that did not germinate completely. And the weird thing was that I had another jug of the exact same plant and that one did germinate, but one didn't. It was a little weird. I didn't understand why that happened. And they were the same seeds out of the same package. So things happen, weird things happen with the gardening and with plants and weather and all kinds of stuff. So you just never know. And then transplants. So make sure that you are transplanting as quickly as you can. Don't worry about taking those transplants. If you put them into pots, don't worry about putting them into a greenhouse or in the garage or in the house. They're hardened off. They should stay outside. Some more resources. wintersown.org is Trudy's website. And Winter Sowers on Facebook is the group that most of us are in from here. And I see we still have about 170 people on. It's pretty cool. I go to the seed site, which is a great website for germination rates and information about specific seeds. And I go to tomclothier.hort.net for the same thing. Both of those resources are good for individual species information. YouTube channels that I have started to watch and to kind of like, I like Susan's in the Garden. I like Y Garden, and I like Esther's Garden Adventures, although I wrote Easter, so don't mind that typo. So Esther's Garden Adventures, Esther is on our Facebook page with us, and she has put out a series of videos about winter sowing, and they're really very good. She's very cheerful, and she's very knowledgeable. So give her a watch. And you know what? Support these gardeners on YouTube by subscribing and liking their videos. It's really important to them to stay relevant in the algorithm. And then if you're really lucky in Chicago in January, you're going to have a nice dry day that's about 40 degrees, and you can get out and you can do your winter sowing outside. This is probably my preferred way to do this, because anyone who lives in a region where it is winter for 6 months out of the year, you know how dark it is, and you get low on vitamin D. And so a day like this where you can sit outside for a few hours and do something that has to do with gardening and get your sun and get your vitamin D, that's really, really, it's really important and really enjoyable. So these are just a few photos of things that I have winter sown and put out in my garden. These are my big zinnias, Will Rogers zinnias to be specific. And that's my cat, who was very quiet today. I gotta say, I'm proud of her. She was really quiet. She usually meows when I do my lectures. These are some more things. Each one of these pots is filled with plants that I winter sowed. So I have some malva in here, tropical milkweed, balloon milkweed. There is that painted tongue plant is in there farther down, and a few other things that weren't blooming yet. This plant was in a lot of the photos. It's called yellow cornflower. It's a really cool plant. I've winter sowed it a couple years in a row. Winter sows very well. It's a great bumblebee plant. It's not a native to the North America, but it is it's a very interesting big plant for your garden. So make sure you give it room. It gets about 2.5, 3 feet tall. It gets about 4 feet wide, and it's just every year it just gets bigger and covered with more and more of these big fluffy yellow flowers. And like I said, bumblebees really like it. So in conclusion, I have to say that this is probably one of the most enjoyable things about gardening for me. I've gardened for over 20 years, and I teach gardening, and I garden at work, and I garden at home, and I garden with the master gardeners, and I teach people how to garden. And winter sowing is one of the more enjoyable things that I love doing workshops for. And I love seeing my seeds. I love seeing my seeds germinate. I think for most gardeners, that is one of the most enjoyable things, is actually getting the satisfaction that you put a plant in the soil and you watered it and you gave it sun, and then all of a sudden now you have a plant. So it's a very cool thing to do. So again, find what works for you, share what works for you, and if you have struggles, reach out. And we have a big group of 31,000 people that you can reach out to. And Trudy's on there, and she's awesome to reach out to. So don't be afraid to try it if you haven't tried it yet. And we're going to do some questions now.
Thank you so much, Dolly.
You're welcome.
For everyone there, by saying thank you, there's a lot of really kind notes of gratitude for sharing your knowledge.
Aww.
After 11:30. So if it's okay, I was going to say I have recorded all of the questions that have come up since the first question block in the chat. If it's all right for me to send those to you to answer on your own time, and then we can send it out with the video link.
Could do that.
Wonderful. Yeah, so, and then if anybody thinks of questions later between now and the next few days, I would say just send them to that email, thebusser@purdue.edu. And if you are further interested in seed sowing, check out those resources that Dolly shared. And then if you're further interested in master gardeners, reach out to your county extension office. Any final parting words from you, Dolly?
Just have fun. don't get stressed out about it. Trust the process. The process is a good process. It's not complicated. Don't make it more complicated, and just trust it. You know, put your seeds out there and just trust that they're going to germinate. And if they don't, open your jugs up and they will germinate. And use fresh seed.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for your time. Yeah, have a great rest of your weekend. We'll get those questions and the video links out to you in the handouts. And if you haven't received emails from us already, send an email to that busser at purdue.edu so we can get you that info. Thanks everyone and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.